the traditional teachings and with the Western. So Diana is an educator with 30 years of experience in K-12 schools and post-secondary institutions. She is currently the president of Yellowhead Tribal College, and most importantly, she is mother and first teacher of her 2 children. She is particularly grateful to elders, knowledge keepers who have guided and mentored her in Indigenous knowledge and ways of being as a Kise Esqueu, recognizing the value and work of it. Now I get to practice Nehiyaw that I've been studying with Ruben Quinn. So recognize the value and work of Inul Pimatisawin. Diana's work as a change agent in language, education, and treaty is grounded upon her late father's adage, Pimatis itotetan. And I think Diana will be able to say that much better than me. Pimatis itotetan kime I kowisawin in now. Let us live life the way our Creator intended us to live. My apologies to the Nehiyaw speakers, as I know I didn't do that very well, saying that. We hope you will be able to join us today in just welcoming Dr. Diana Steinhauer to share her knowledge and her teachings with us, or some of her knowledge and teachings with us this evening. Welcome, Dr. Diana Steinhauer.
Kita jam sekarang awal kakyo na wago manganti. We waiting for what permit the book. Ego nanas kamal while. And notes. So I just want to give greetings to you all as my relatives, and I just express my thanks to Lyle for leading us with the opening prayer. I am really happy to be here and to share a snippet of what I can share within a 30-minute block and open it up for questions afterwards. So the instructions I received are to give you a sense of what and how we perceive our lands as treaty peoples that made a treaty with the Crown, and how Canada has a narrative. You are all very familiar with that narrative, and that narrative, I see it everywhere. I have done lit reviews. I've read books that had lit reviews of what's written in history. And the narrative says that the treaties were land deals where our nations of people sold the land and to the Crown, and as a result, we got reserves. And everything else is outside of our purview. In exchange for the lands, we got rights. And pretty much that's the narrative, and everybody goes by that narrative. I've done presentations in many, many places with people in similar ages to you. You have a wide range of people on this call, and just want to acknowledge that. What I want to share this evening with you is our understanding of treaty, from our knowledge, from our teachings, from our oral history, from the lands that we were placed upon. And I'm going to show you some pictures. I'm also going to give you some words. And if you want to have my PowerPoint, I'm happy to share that with you. So I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see my pictures and so on. And I'm starting with a pretty much a, is this an okay size for everybody? Or can
yes, we can read it, see it well. Thank you.
Okay, so there are two, you're going to find that there are two distinctive definitions that that are at play right now. And this slide speaks to both of those definitions, or both of those descriptions of who we are. And I'll just read this to you, that this treaty confirmed title differ from Aboriginal title. And rather than going through the whole bit of this, this was written from a British Columbia point of view. And what's really important here are the words at the bottom where it's talking about radical Indigenous title. And I'm borrowing this slide from one of my contemporaries, a researcher named Rari Hakwatz, who is a Haudenosaunee person who passed away earlier this year. But radical Indigenous title is another term for root title, or another term that can be describing that is allodial title, and then assumed crown title. And within that latter context, Aboriginal title, okay? So I don't count myself as an Aboriginal person, even though the Section 35 of Canada's Constitution Act describes Aboriginal people as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. That whole area of jurisprudence is, and I'll describe some of this as I go through, is a way of subjugating our peoples to become domesticated under Canada. And right now we possess radical title to all of the lands where the treaties were made. Those were not land sales. I'll move on to the next slide. You probably have a lot of questions. And when Haley first got in touch with me, she did mention that you have questions about the land. And I asked her, or I sent her a link that people could watch beforehand. And if you had, then these terms are not new to you. Then you have some background. If you haven't watched that video, then I would suggest you do take a look at it. It's only like 20 minutes and it's really very informative. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So there are a lot of myths that are perpetuated about treaty. And for instance, these are the common myths. The treaty dealt with resources. Now I'm talking about treaties that are like I'm on Treaty 6 land. Some of you are on Treaty 7 lands. But there are 11 numbered treaties that take up a whole chunk of land, which we call Indian country, if you want to use that term. So there's a myth that treaties dealt with resources. The treaties did not mention resources at all. Another myth is that the treaty gave away the land with no compensation. In fact, the treaty called for $1 for each acre used for settlement. And in Treaty 6, for instance, Treaty 7 as well, it was land that was arable and it was requested for agricultural purposes. We never ever received that $1 per acre, and that's not intended to be a sale of land. It's just for use. And so some compensation for the use, allowing us to use the land for agricultural purposes, for instance. Another myth is that the treaty allowed for the land to be used for any purpose. No, the treaty was for the sole purpose of immigration and settlement. And then another myth that's on this page, the treaty gave away the land which could not be used for immigration and settlement. No, title remained with the Indigenous nations for lands not used for settlement. So in the early beginnings of treaties, there weren't very many people from Europe or other places around the world yet. So whatever wasn't used was to remain in our possession. That was the intent of treaty. And then the last slide with a lot of words on it is this one. And this is why I differentiate the term Aboriginal or Aboriginal title versus what is confirmed based on our treaties, confirmed by us, our ancestors, about 7 generations ago. So on the left-hand side is Aboriginal title, where the Crown assumes or asserts sovereignty. On our side, the Crown requests our consent to allow it to exercise conditional sovereignty for immigration and settlement. On the left, under Aboriginal title, settlement is usually in place. And in our side, it's no settlement is in place. No compensation for lands and resources according to Aboriginal title, but on our side, yes, compensation is required for lands and resources. Certain rights are granted under Aboriginal title, but under our understanding, we've never ever agreed to come under Canada. In fact, in Canada's constitution, the British North America Act that was passed in Parliament in Great Britain in 1867, we were excluded from that because we were not subjects of the crown. We never were intended to be subjects because we were dealt with as nations of peoples. And requirement to prove Aboriginal title. So right now in BC and other places that don't have treaties, the Indigenous populations there have to prove they have title, and it's called Aboriginal title. So there's a really big world of difference when you look at the treaties, and our treaties confirm that we had title and we still retain and possess that title by entering into treaty. So that is just a really quick snapshot of the difference between Aboriginal and when we're talking about our peoples as nations of people. When we entered into treaty, we were looking at a peace and friendship relationship with the Crown. Not that there were any wars or anything on our lands. In fact, our lands are the laws of our lands are guided by this symbol of this bear. The bear actually is the keeper of the lands. And we have a story within our ceremonies about the role that the bear performed in a number of ways. And in one of those, they protected the peoples and the lands of what we call Turtle Island. So I'm going to share a little bit of what that means in terms of what does it mean when I say realizing the vision of Turtle Island. So here's an image of petroglyphs, and petroglyphs are actually written on stone. This is an aerial photograph of the Peterborough petroglyphs. And in this particular site, there's about 700. And how this is connected to our stories and our understanding and our cosmology is the creator and our older brother put these here. And they captured into the petroglyph the stories of the past, the present, and the future. And we say this is a living place. It has life. There's water that runs through these crevices. And it's a natural place, and all of these images have stories connected to it that we just have to go there and look at what's going on, what images are appearing more strongly than others, and we know what's going on because it's based on the decisions that we make as human beings that these plates have a tendency to shift to show us our direction. So here is a few petroglyphs from that site that I've generated through this computer. So this speaks about education, this one here. And this is the people who come from overseas and land on our shores. And by the nature of this anchor, in speaking with my grandfather, the late Peter O'Chase, he said that the intention of the creator in bringing the people here and having the people come here to our lands, Turtle Island, which is all of North Central America, is that he wanted us to be kind to all of his creation, including all of his children, no matter where they were from. So that includes everybody, all of humanity. And we have stories about how we are all related. So this is about education, and I was asked to talk a little bit about education, but in relation to the land, in relation to the ability to give life, that's the women's capacity, the women's power, and our people have always acknowledged the place of women in the roles and responsibilities women have in relation to the lands and the waters. So we have jurisdiction, essentially. So what this is here is a man who's holding two bundles in his arms. And that's a man who's living life according to the original instructions the Creator was given to that gave to us in relation to all of life. So this is a very strong, powerful position. In other places of the treaty, I looked and I saw a man just standing with one bundle, and the other his other arm was outstretched. And I asked my grandfather, I said, what is that about? And he said, it's a man who shared his bundles with the Queen's people that came here, and that's the treaty position. And then in another place, I saw a man with absolutely no bundles, and he said, don't go there. He said, stay in this position. That's your power position. And that's where we stand right now as treaty peoples. We've never given away anything. In fact, everything that we retained when we entered into treaty, we got more on top of that. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So here's another petroglyph, and this is the Vision of Turtle Island petroglyph, and that's what this represents. So you see here bullseye, concentric circles. That means all of the peoples of the world are to come here. We're to share our lands with the peoples, and that's indeed what we did. You see here the animals and the birds in this directional triangular arrow, which says, you know, the birds and the animals will never forget their way. They will always maintain their allegiance and their alliance and their original instructions the Creator gave to them. And so if we have a tendency to forget or lose our way, we just have to look at what the birds and animals are doing, and they'll point us in the right direction. And that's why that triangle is saying this is the right direction. So we start over here, and you see that this path is really dotted. It's very faint. The pathway is very faint. Very few people were living life that the Creator intended for us to live. And what was going on here is our people were struggling because we were interfered with significantly in our past with many, many things, legislation, policies, and so on. Everything about us was outlawed in terms of our governance and our ceremonies during a period between 1886 to 1951. And when they lifted that ban on our ceremonies, they didn't bother telling us. So we didn't really practice our ceremonies openly until the 1970s. And then the path gets stronger and stronger. And as we get closer to the bullseye, to the Creator's vision of Turtle Island, the path is really, really strong. There are many, many people moving in that direction. And so this has become my mantra in terms of the work that I do. I believe that I do Creator's work here on Earth. And this is what motivates me to continue to do this, because when I was speaking with my grandfather, it was 1982, and he said, I'm not going to see this day where this comes to pass. He said, you might, but for sure your children and your grandchildren will. And that when I heard that, I realized that I have work to do, because there's so much misunderstanding between our peoples that we have a lot of educating to do. So I appreciate the time that we're spending tonight. In the Treaty of Fort Niagara in 1764, the two-row wampum of the Haudenosaunee people was used as the basis for all of the treaties that were to come between our peoples, the peoples of these lands and the Crown. So this is a wampum belt, which says we will share the river of life together, each in our own vessel, you in your boat and us in our canoe. There are three wampum shells that separate this path with this path from this vessel. And those three wampum beads represent peace, friendship, and respect. And so it was never intended for either one of them to interfere with anybody, the other vessel's governance. And so these other symbols are very important. I won't go into them. So people often say, well, that's the Haudenosaunee people, but we have the same. So ours is written in stone as well. And this is in current day Manitoba, and where Little Black River is. And this is my uncle Jimmy O'Chiefs with my nephew Ben, and they're doing how we pass knowledge on from generation to generation. He's learning about the two roads of the treaty. So I have a graphic here that I represent this petroglyph on, and this is what it looks like. So here's our path, and the path of what our governance is and how we have allegiance to the Creator. And the crown that came here asking us to share, to be kind to one another, to be honest with one another, to share the land to the depth of the plow. And that was what the treaties were about, 6 inches of soil. And that we would be strong in each of our own governance pathways. And that's why these roads are perpetual. They're to last as long as the sun shines, the waters flow, and the grass grows. And those 3 symbols represent our sovereignty, the sovereignty of our people, our jurisdiction. Sovereignty is the sun as long as the sun shines. That's as long as we're following our laws. And those are the laws that were given to us by the Creator, which are maintained in our pipe ceremonies, in our pipe, the woman's pipe and the men's pipe. And then the jurisdiction comes from the women in relation to the lands, and she has the capacity for the lands and the waters, and she shared that, but maintains the jurisdiction nonetheless. And then the governance is as long as the grass grows, and that's representing our relationship with the lands and all that is there, including the 4-legged, like the buffalo, for instance. So we maintained all of this. And on top of that, we got medicine chest, the famine and pestilence clauses, education, no taxes, etc. And why don't we pay tax? We only pay tax, no tax on reserves right now. But the reason why is no government in the world would tax another government's people. That's called a preemptory norm I guess amongst international law. And so my grandfather said in the future, they will make laws for you, intended for you. So here are some boxes, and each one of these are laws that are First Nations this, or First Nations that, or Indigenous this and Indigenous that. And he said, he said, they're going to build a bridge and invite you to come over, abandon your side and come over here and become domesticated to Canada. And I said, well, if that's a bridge, it's only half a bridge. And he said, well, it is a bridge, but they know their jurisdiction can only come this far, because this is their jurisdiction under treaty, and this is our jurisdiction under treaty. So there's so much more on this slide I can share. But here are the lands of the treaties, and it's a significant part of the land. So all of these are in color, are actual lands that were peace and friendship treaties. And I have another map here that shows how Canada actually looks. So all of the lands that are in color and dots here and there in BC, Canada has concluded either modern day treaties, and that's what Canada does, is modern day treaties, and land claim settlements. So when under those 2 processes, the First Nations, Indigenous, Inuit peoples, they extinguish their title to the land completely and wholly and legally and legitimately in exchange for money, in exchange for rights, limited rights. So this is, I always like to show this and say, this is how Canada actually looks, because it does not include our lands. Although when Alberta and Saskatchewan came under the Canadian Constitution in terms of the NRTA Act in 1930, they said they have administration over lands, minerals, mines, resources, subject to other interests, because they didn't ask our permission to do that transfer. And the subject to other interests are our interests, because they passed a law in Parliament before they made the 1930 NRTA Act. It was in 1927. They forbade any legal person, any lawyer, to represent Indians in court with anything to do with lands. So they basically shut us out of this whole parlay between the Canadian federal government and the provincial governments. So we have, as the video that I suggested that Haley give you the link to, Janice Whitlow, who's an international lawyer, describes how we maintain title to our lands. And that's the underlying title. And what the Crown has is called absolute title. So what's the difference between a allodial title and absolute title is we are here with the treaties, and the Crown asks permission underneath our granting of that permission. And with absolute title, she can then give out lands through fee simple title and so on to corporations and individuals. But it still rests upon our title. A lot of people don't understand that, and they just assume that the province owns these lands, but in fact, the province does not own these lands. They have administrative status over the land subject to our interests. I'm just going to go into maybe 2 more slides and then I'll stop and we can talk. In terms of the treaties, there were terms that related to education. And the term that is written in the treaty is that a schoolhouse will be built on the reserve lands whenever the chiefs shall so desire it. So if we wanted education, we can just say that we want it, and it would be provided. Because when we talk about sharing lands, there is an expectation that there is fair and equitable compensation that is paid to us for the use of our lands. In the beginning, it was 50-50. So anything that was taken off our lands, 50% of it went into what was called at that time Indian trusts, Indian trust funds. And that was held by the Queen and under her Indian affairs, under the Superintendent General of her army in Britain. In 1852, before Canada became a colony, a dominion, they asked the Queen to transfer those monies, Indian trust funds, to Canada. They would look after it for us. They'd become our trustee. And that they also wanted Indian Affairs to come over. So in the beginning, before the Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, had to answer to the Indian Affairs Superintendent General. And so the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs was above the Prime Minister, and he didn't like that. So as soon as they got the B&A Act, he moved Indian Affairs under a department under the Canadian, under Canada, under the federal government. And that's what Section 9124 is about, in our relationship to the federal government. People misunderstand that section. They think they have the capacity to make legislation for us or over us. In fact, it's about in relationship to, or in relation to us. They never asked for our permission to pass any laws. In fact, under our 2 roads, we would not interfere with their legislation, whereas they shouldn't be interfering with ours. So my grandfather was right. They can only build a bridge halfway. And only when we start behaving like that, those laws apply to us, then we actually are turning our back on our treaty. A treaty is forever. One party cannot dissolve the treaty without the consent of the other party. So we're here to live in peace, friendship, and respect forever for all of the generations to come. And we believe that this notion of the realization of the creator's vision of Turtle Island, where all the people of the world are to come here, and that we are to benefit each other in terms of our understanding, and what we have as responsibilities and teachings are to benefit each other. So there isn't this idea of one is dominant over the other, and that's what we believe in, and the treaties were intended as such. So I put the picture of this image here, and it's an aerial photograph. I just went over my 30 minutes. This will be my last slide. Aerial photograph of a place just in Cypress Hills, close to Medicine Hat. And this image, if you see it from the air, you obviously see a profile of a Native man. And there's a woman's profile not too far away from this place that you can see from the air, but that's a place where the Creator took the land to make our bodies. And then the sun had a role in that. And that's what the heat, the fire, the spirit that is within each one of us. And the water is within us. And so is the air, which is what we breathe. Those are the helpers of the Creator that we embody in our bodies. That's why we're called the Nehiyaw people, the four-bodied people. And I just want you to be aware that there is a lot of education, a lot of educating, and a lot of understanding between our peoples in order for us to come to the realization of that vision of creators Turtle Island. This image is when the Creator and Mother Earth finished those first two human beings, the male and the female. They were lowered down from the sky to the earth. So we were placed here. We didn't come from Beringia or Asia or anywhere else. We were placed here by the Creator. And this is the place, if you ever go to Jasper, this is the first mountain range that you see. And it's the first man and the first woman. So the man's face is right here. It's forever imprinted on the land to remind us that we belong here. The woman's face is here. You can just see that, so the back of her head, because she's facing southwest. But if you go up the Mayat Road and stop and look to the right, you'll see her face as well. So these are the first two people that greet you when you come into the Rocky Mountains. So the Rocky Mountains to us are sacred places. So I'm going to say again, Kitatam Scout now, wow. And that just means I'm grateful to see you all. We are all related, and I shake hands with each one of you. So I'm going to open up for questions. I do have one more slide, and I think that question will come up. I have it ready in my last slide if it does, because there was a question about the lands in relation to burial places. And let me just bring it up. It's a lot of words. So on the bottom here, it says, laws were enacted to suppress religious practices. I mentioned that. And items with spiritual import were often confiscated. So the provinces have ownership of archaeological material because that's in their laws on both private and public lands asserted by the Crown. So I use the term assert. The Crown can assert sovereignty here because of the treaties that we allowed her to set up her government here. But we have sovereignty. We don't have to assert it. We just have it. It's predicated on the fact that we're nations that entered into international treaties. So when you look at archaeologists, they are protected in terms of anything that they find, in terms of their digs, they have possession of, and it belongs to the province. And that's why they will often send bones and so on to museums or universities so that they could do whatever they do with them. Because it becomes their property. But how we are not protected in provincial laws is that these people can consult with us as a courtesy, and they often don't. So whatever they find belongs to them, and it goes to the museums and other places like that. So we always say we need to leave those places in the ground. And if you do find them, then we need to do ceremony to respect the people that were our ancestors, and that we should be able to have the management of those places while this is happening. So I just wanted to add that into this slideshow. So I'm going to stop there and just invite you to ask questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Diana. That was, I see where my confusion was, is where I'm looking at vision and intent as opposed to implementation. And I think that's where my confusion is that I don't understand, sort of what happened, if you know what I mean, if that makes any sense. So, but you sort of spelled that out a little bit, and it does give me sort of a right direction that what we should be looking for rather than what's going on. So thank you for that. Any other questions? Okay, then I'll do it. I sent one in the chat about the Indian Resource Trust Fund. Now, if I understand correctly, that was while Indian Affairs was still in England under the Crown.
Okay, so Indian trust funds. I can bring up a slide because I actually have another PowerPoint open here.
Well, it was the Resource Trust Fund in particular that was supposed to be there for, you know, the care and attention, the care and keep of us, and somehow got rolled into general revenue, as far as I can tell.
You're right. What happened is, okay, so let me just pull this one up. Share screen. Where'd it go? There it is. That's it. Indian trust funds. So it was started in 1750. Everything that the crown came over here to, you know, to enrich the mother country, essentially. So in fair dealings, recognized that we have title to these lands and everything here, and said as a business deal that everything coming off the lands, we would get 50 cents for every dollar. And that includes all the natural resources that came out of British North America at the time, and that's 1750 language. And she created these trust funds. And I was mentioning that's when the British people of the Dominion of Canada in 1850 petitioned the Crown to bring Indian trusts and the Office of Indian Affairs to Canada. And these trust funds were alive and well until 1913. So what happened in 1913? Well, the federal government finished the CP, the Canadian Pacific Railroad. And when they finished that, they were near bankruptcy. And so what they decided to do is take our money, the Indian Trust Fund money, and roll it together into the Canada's Consolidated Revenue Fund. So this is why we get funding from the federal government, because it's our money. It's that trust fund money that they're trustees of. And this slide is probably too small. So I'm just going to try and blow it up here. Anyway, Indian people are seen as freeloaders.
You can see it.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, we're seen as freeloaders, that we get everything for free. But it's because of this relationship that we have with the Crown, that and this money that comes off our lands. In 2015, Canada in a statement of defense, because there was a court case in federal court. The Deputy Minister, Scott Stevenson, at the time is quoted here as, "Canada vehemently denies that it has stated or implied that Indian money as defined by the Indian Act are public funds or public tax revenues." So there's this myth that we are a drain on Canada's tax-paying citizens. But in fact, here's the Minister of Indian Affairs, or Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs, saying that's not the case. It's in federal court. It's on the record. This was in the C-27 First Nations Financial Transparency Act, where the Indian Affairs took 5 of our chiefs to court, our nations to court, First Nations, because we wouldn't comply. I mean, we don't have to comply with federal laws, really, truly, and honestly. And this is where we found out that Canada's privacy laws do not apply to Indians. In fact, a lot of the laws don't apply to Indians. We were left out of the BNA Act because we are not Canadians. We were not Canadians. We were not British subjects. We were nations. And you don't just take a whole group of nations and put them underneath you without their consent. So Canada didn't have citizenship until 47 with the Citizenship Act. Prior to that, everybody were British subjects that lived here in Canada. And with that, they entered us into as citizens of Canada without our consent in 1960. They didn't ask us our permission. They just said, well, Indians can be Canadians now. They can vote and they can go into places where we were previously not allowed to go. But truly, a lot of the laws that are in place don't apply to us. They want them to apply to us, and they want us to comply with them. And a lot of our people do. So the rest of the slide is just information about, breaking myth busting, that we are not a burden on society as the tax-paying citizens would want to believe. They're a burden on us because you're living on our lands, and we often don't get fair compensation for a lot of what we are entitled to. This shows, for instance, in that year, 2014, 2015, we were accorded $8.7 billion. And there's 630 Indian First Nations reserves right across Canada. Some of them have taken self-government, by the way. But of that 8.7 billion, 19% of it goes to run the whole Indian Affairs shebang, all of the whole bureaucracy right across Canada and down in Gatineau. And 21% of that money goes to other, and they refuse to tell us what that other is, but it really goes to the provinces and on our behalf. And we often don't get, that funding directly to us. Somebody else is looking after it. So INAC actually takes 40% right off the top. And so for the rest of that 60% of that 8.7 billion, it's divided into 600 pieces. So by the time it comes into our hands, we are administering our own poverty. So that's why we have boil water advisories, and we have really poor health outcomes and so on. So we are pretty much drip fed, but the wealth of our lands is incredible. And this tells you how much Treaty 8 is worth and how much Treaty 6 is worth. It's 136,006 square miles in Treaty 6. And I used to have the one for Treaty 7, but it's not in this slide. But the Treaty 7 lands, we're just looking at what's currently considered Alberta on our treaty boundaries. So we are wealthy people, but we are not allowed to administer our own funding. They treat us like we are children. So that's that's an issue. But thank you for asking that question. I hope I answered it okay.
Yeah, no, very well. I appreciate that a lot.
I have a question, Diana. One of the things I heard too from you is you said we have a lot of educating to do, and we're here this evening and we're learning ourselves. And, my understanding is when knowledge or understanding shared with us, it's important that we share that with others. And I just would like to ask, what we can do. There's educators here, there's community members, there's representatives from other organizations. What can we do to help educate not just the children and students, but others too in our lives, to help share this knowledge, because it's not common knowledge to Canadians, and it really should be.
I would say this is a really good start, like this evening. So thank you for the invitation. You need to make space for the voice of our people in relation to what and how we define ourselves and how we don't define ourselves. And there are a lot of people who've gone through the residential schools who never had a chance to learn their own history from their own people's knowledge bases. So there's a disconnect for our own people. And I was really lucky in having the privilege of being schooled, or I shouldn't say schooled, homeschooled, unschooled by incredible knowledge keepers in my lifetime. And they started teaching me when I was very, very young. So yes, start with the children, helping them to understand. I've looked at the curriculum on treaties, and I see that it's always showing the Canadian narrative version of treaties. Mm-hmm. You to press forward on the oral understanding of treaties, because the treaty has two parties, and it's not up to one party to interpret that treaty from their own vantage point. It's important to hear both sides. So I always make it a point to share everything that I do with people. And I just say, if you understand this well enough, please share it with others, because our story and our narrative needs to get out there. And any way you can, give us that capacity to share. And that's one of the good things that has come about as a result of reconciliation. We've been invited into places we've never been invited to before to share our understanding of treaty. We were invited to meet with provincial court judges, and that never happened in the past. And other places, like different places within your communities, within your organizations. And we need to debunk that Canadian narrative, because it creates a dominant and subordinate position when the treaties were meant to be peaceful, respectful, and within a stance of friendship, because we are all related. We are all part of the human family within our paradigm, within our construct of the world, of our cosmology. We accept all of humanity as our relatives, and that's what those treaties were intended to create, relationships of that sort, and to really the idea of race. We don't have a word for race in our languages, because that's not coming from us. So I don't use the word Indigenous to describe myself, or Aboriginal, because both of them have been brought into a definition of people who are dominated. The United Nations has accorded those terms with new definitions, and it means people who are like original peoples who are dominated. And I just want to always remind people that we are human beings. All of us are human beings, including us. The doctrine of discovery is another horrendous piece of I don't know what to call it. It's a papal bull. And it's been now included in courts, and that's why we don't want our treaties in courts, because the courts will interpret us as beasts of the field. And that's what the doctrine of discovery does, is it doesn't give us humanity. And it's really, it's racist. It's against the rule of law. And it's really unconstitutional if you want to bring it right down to that, just as the Indian Act is. But unfortunately, the Indian Act identifies that we still have ownership of the land. The original definition of reserved lands is what our definition of what our lands are about. They belong to us completely. We did cut out of the deal, the treaty sharing, lands that we said are entirely for our own exclusive use, and we weren't going to share those lands. And that's what those reserved lands are. And the Indian Act identifies those lands as that. It also identifies the fact that we identify who our peoples are, although there's a lot of interference in that one as well with our membership. So anyway, the rest of the Indian Act can go, but those two pieces have to stay.
Well, Diane, I really want to thank you. We should go on for at least another hour with you, because it's so in depth and multi-layered, and we've only just scratched the surface, I know, but we also need to continue on with our business tonight. So I want to thank you, for your presentation, and now this was recorded